Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all back with us, and this will potentially be our last. Is it working? There you go. This will potentially be our last live stream that is only live streamed. Next Wednesday is July 1st, and our hope is to open ourselves up to regular services. All right, so we'll see what happens. In the meantime, just keep praying for one another and looking for opportunities to be a blessing and share the gospel. Tonight we have a special thing for you, as Captain Bly is going to be starting up a new series on worldviews, and looking forward to joining him with that for the rest of the summer. So we'll have a word of prayer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Captain Bly. Father, we thank you for this opportunity we have to study your word together. Pray that you be with Captain Bly as he teaches us, that we would grow in your grace through it. We ask that you would keep everyone healthy, and as we begin to open things back up and come back together, that you would keep us healthy and help us to be able to use these opportunities to bring glory and honor to you. We'll thank and praise you for all that you do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Captain Bly.
Well, good evening. It's going to be my first time to get a handle on this, keeping my eye on the camera and keeping my eye on the slides. So if I don't look like I'm looking at you, it's because I'm probably not, but we'll get there. All right, so this summer we're going to deal with worldviews, or another word would be ideologies, the belief systems that people have that direct, indicate, etc., what they're going to be doing and why. And as we take a look at this, I guess I have two thoughts for you all out there, depending on which one of these categories you find yourself sitting in. But if you're a mom and dad of one of the teens, or a grandparent, or you're connected to some of the teens, what I'm hoping to be able to do this summer is to help you to understand how our teens got to where they are and where their generation is, in comparison to where we are in whatever generation that we might be a part of. And once we start to get a handle on that, and it'll take us a couple of weeks to get to the point where we're actually able to deal with that, hopefully you'll begin to see and be able to understand why things are happening, why things happen the way they did in Indianapolis, why things are happening in pick a city, Wanamaker even for that matter, or Shelbyville. And if we understand the background for this and where the agenda is going and who's directing it and what are the thought processes and where did this actually begin to manifest itself, where did it grow up, if you will, we'll be able to deal with this. So I'll probably, let's see. I'll probably have the slides up a good bit of the time, although I'll come back online a good bit of the time. So this is what we're going to be dealing with this summer. And, oops, wait a minute. I have two things I have to do here. I have two gadgets. So when we talk about this idea of worldviews and how are we going to go about the process of attempting to understand this, my military background always comes out, and my plan of attack is this. I want to walk through some basics. For many people, the idea, or just the word worldviews, it's one of those, what some people call an academic term that everybody else on the street doesn't really understand, but yet it's impacting their lives. And so I want to begin with some basics as it relates to this. Then I want to take a look at the options. When we talk about worldviews, there are two basic types of worldviews. And then there are variations as it relates to that, and we'll look at some of that. I want you to understand who the players are. And so when we take a look at the world in which we live, every one of us is a player in the process of ideas, the generation of ideas, the transmission of ideas, regardless of what generation we happen to be a part of. And we'll look at some of that. And then I want to look at some resources that some of you may want to look into. Others are going to say, okay, I'm just going to let Captain Bly walk us through this, and that's fine. And then finally, we'll look at the consequences of these idea sets, et cetera, that that are part of what's going on in the world today. So as we take a look at the idea of a worldview, there's a very simple definition. It's this: a set of beliefs. Now, I'm using the word beliefs very deliberately because everybody has a set of beliefs, and oftentimes people affiliate that with just the idea of religion. Well, unfortunately, that undermines the explanation, the understanding of people, because everybody has a religion. We talked about this in summers gone by, but we need to remind ourselves everybody has a set of beliefs, and they determine how we think. And so the flip of this would be, well, if people don't have beliefs, then the consequences, then they don't think. Now, there may be some truth to that, but that's not exactly where we really want to be. But these beliefs then direct a person's actions or how we live our lives. And if we can build that connection between the beliefs and the actions, we'll begin to understand even what is happening, what happened in Minneapolis, what happened in St. Paul, what happened in Washington, D.C., Seattle, etc., as well as what's been happening here in Indianapolis, more local to us. And the other aspect of this, and this is from our perspective as a body of believers, is this: those beliefs and those actions are actually setting a course or a path for eternity. It tells everybody else where we're going, because the behaviors, the thought processes, the actions that we're engaging in, all are an indicator of who we actually are. And as you think through this, and we start to look at the different options, you'll begin to realize, oh, there really is a distinction, a separation, a setting apart of those two different option sets that are there. Then next, too, everyone has a worldview, or more, one or more worldviews. And that's something that we need to be very conscious of, and we need to understand. What does it mean if I have two worldviews? That is to say, I have two sets of beliefs, and I act one way one place and one way another place. Where am I really going? Who am I really? And does the rest of the world see the difference between the two of those? Yes, they do. Also, every worldview is changing daily, because our worldview is a product of the information that we're absorbing, whether it's from a message that pastor teaches, or from the revival meetings last week, or for the teens, the messages that they listen to up at camp. All of that, plus just listening to CNN or Fox News or wherever you're picking up your daily information, all of those information streams are impacting your worldview. And they will affect it whether you are objectively thinking about it or you're just kind of floating along. As we think about this idea of a worldview, it's built over time and is a function of age. And when I say that, it's where you began. And in a minute, we'll look at that, and I'll try to help you to understand why understanding what generation you are part of will help you and everybody else to understand what's going on in your life, but also to help you to understand what has happened in the generation subsequent to that. And then education, the whole process of education, whether it's formal or informal. And then the other piece of this is that every worldview requires faith decisions. Now, as we think about this, before I get into the two options, the options, I need you to try to grasp a hold of some terms. I'm going to use the words twoism and oneism, and to make that simple, and that's what I'm trying to do here, is that there's people who have one set of standards, one set of objectives, one set of beliefs, or one belief, and then there is, without any distinctions, it's everything is one, and there are no distinctions, right? On the other side, there's what we're going to call twoism. It means that there are distinctions. And as we move along tonight, you'll begin to understand why an understanding of these distinctions become important and how they impact what is going on. So as we take a look at the options, there is a sense in which there's really only two options. One is the biblical Orthodox Christian option, and the other is the oneism option. And the three primary subgroups within that are an eclectic one, which we're going to have to break down, secular humanism or the secular humanist, and then the pagan. And you may say, why are we using the word pagan? Well, we are using the word pagan because of the extent to which paganism is a part of our culture and how that is impacting the decision-making and the lifestyles and everything that is going along with it. There's a lot more behind it, which we will get to eventually. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on option one here for a second, because there is an aspect of option one that is also in option two, or the eclectic view. When we talk about a biblical Orthodox Christian view, worldview, and we look at it in retrospect going back a couple of hundred years and then even further back, there is a statement that characterizes the biblical Orthodox Christian view almost universally across the entire spectrum of what we know as Christianity, including Catholicism, as well as the other mainline Protestant, as well as the churches like us who are called part of the Free Church. And it is this statement that basically defines this particular option. It is the full, inerrant authority of Scripture in doctrine and practice. Up until about the mid-1800s, when you talked about Christianity, almost no one would declare themselves to be a Christian if they did not accept the fact and believe in and live according to the idea that when they take a look at the Bible, it is completely inerrant. It is the absolute authority, and it covers both doctrine and practice. That is what you believe in your mind and then how you live your life. Beginning in the 1800s, mid-1800s, this began to be, there were cracks in this that began to be characteristic of many people within Christianity. And unfortunately, the cracking of the solid foundation has had its impact. The second aspect of it is the idea that, and this is where you get the idea of twoism, there is absolute objective truth, and there's absolute objective moral absolutes. And I know that's a redundancy in terms of the usage of the word absolute. But that word is extremely important here as we're taking a look at this. Absolute means that there is no competitor. There is no other argument. And as we take a look at this, and we take a look at the Scriptures, and we take a look at the consequences of decision-making, we will begin to realize the significance of this when you eliminate the word either absolute or objective, etc. Now, on the other side of the equation, and the reason that I have this first quote is because I want you to understand that the competition, if you will, between this biblical Orthodox, and we could say Judeo-Christian worldview with this absolutely authoritative, inerrant Bible is in direct competition, has always been in direct competition with the idea that man is the measure of all things. And that goes back to Protagoras in the 5th century BC. And I put that there for you because I want you to understand that this is not something new. This conflict between these two sets of worldviews is not something that all of a sudden emerged in the 20th century or in the 21st century. It has been around for almost all of human history. In fact, you can see elements of it when you go back through the early chapters of the book of Genesis, when we start to deal with Adam and Eve and their sons and the murder and all the rest of that. The second aspect of this is man is autonomous. And with this is the idea that nobody gets to tell me to do anything. And we'll look at this a little bit more, but then there's the issue of accommodation. Well, we'll have some of this and some of that. And in the 20th century, late 1800s and early 20th century, it's when the interfaith conversations began. Now, when we use the word interfaith, I use the word interfaith in the context of these lectures. What I'm talking about is not just within Christianity. It's interfaith conversations with Hindus, Buddhists, animists, outright pagans, etc. And then we moved a little bit further in the 20th century, the late 20th century, to the point where we have what is known as interfaith pluralism. And this is, you begin to see the consequences over time of tearing down and eliminating this whole idea of a full, inerrant, authoritative Bible as the core for a worldview. But out of this comes a position, in contrast to absolute objective truth and moral absolutes. We have relative subjective truth, relative subjective morals, and personal opinion becomes authoritative, which is to say, my opinion, your opinion, everyone walking down the street of Indianapolis or wherever, their personal opinion is absolutely authoritative in their life, and they have the right to live life in light of that reality. And so you begin to see the consequences of this in terms of human behavior as we move forward here. As we continue this, when we take a look at this, these two options here from a macro perspective, the other thing that separates these is the idea of antithesis and synthesis. And when we talk about antithesis and synthesis, this is where the rubber really meets the road. Because if your worldview, which is what the biblical Orthodox Christian worldview has always held to, is that there is a healthy tension in the realm of antithesis. That is to say, there are distinctions, there are opposites, etc. With synthesis, you have something much more confusing in the sense that it's all a morass. It's all just in the mixing bowl, and it's all mixed up. And we'll come back to that in a second. But so for this particular position, there is the importance of understanding that there is a creator-creation or creator-creature distinction. And when you accept the fact that there is a creator and there is a creation, there's a subordination aspect of things. And then to look at the next line here, divine and human. God is not man, man is not God. Now, that's what the scriptures give us by way of an explanation. And if you begin with just those two alone, you quickly realize that those distinctions, as absolute distinctions, because the scriptures inherently describe and define and outline that for us, we begin to see the tension that we see with the rest of the world. And so then the other two things that are part of this is the idea that there is good and evil, and there is right and wrong. And to use a math equation, A is not equal to B. That is to say, right is not wrong. Wrong is not right. God is not creation or a creature, and man is not God. Well, when you build both of those, all of those together into a statement of understanding, you quickly realize that this whole idea of man responsible to God, and there is a God to whom man is going to be held, accountable and responsible, and there is going to be a time when we have to answer up to God himself. That has a massive impact in the way people function. Well, then, when we move over to the other side, and this has many permutations in terms of the way people look at this, So when you look at this, have you ever heard people say, I'm spiritual, but not religious? Well, what does that mean? How do you understand that? How do you live in that light? Well, it's easy to live in that light if, in fact, I, you, every other individual is the absolute authority to whom I'm accountable. I'm accountable to no one else. And therefore, my opinion is absolutely authoritative. And the decisions that I make are absolutely authoritative. And nobody gets to question it. And when you begin on that platform, then there's what we would call cultural relativism. All aspects of culture are of equal value. And this is where the oneism begins to have significance. Everything is of equal value. There are no distinctions. There are no categorizations. There's no one is better than another. Everything is a function of subjective inner feelings, or my inner response, or my inner witness. All words that are used in the literature to try to understand. And it's we can talk, well, my inner feelings. I have my inner feelings. You have your inner feelings. Yes, we do. But what do we do with those feelings becomes important. We'll come back to this, but when you think about your inner feelings, well, it makes me feel good if I break a window and I steal a TV. But that wasn't your TV and you didn't pay for it. And the answer to it is, oh, that doesn't matter because it makes me feel good. And as long as it makes me feel good, it then becomes right. And therefore I can do this tomorrow and the next day, and I can be part of a mob and a crowd, and we can go and do this, and we can tear down things, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the dilemma that we're facing. And it's something that is relatively new to the West, okay? In other parts of the world that don't have the Judeo-Christian foundation, it is less of an issue. But here we have this idea that all is equal, and these are hard statements that are made by the people who subscribe to this oneism worldview. All is equal. There is no evil and there is no wrong. Now, I can't get my head around that one. I guess it's because I've been a Christian so long, and I grew up with the principles of Christianity, even though I was not a Christian as a youngster, and even as a teenager, and as a early young adult. But I knew that there was right and wrong. I knew that there was evil, and I knew that everything wasn't equal. But nevertheless, there's an element of the world today that an element of the population that will get right in your face on this one, and when you argue the fact that there is evil or there is wrong, and there is good and evil, and they can be contrasted, or there is right and wrong. And so as you think about this is where we begin to see the consequences. Well, when we have this idea that the scriptures are authoritative, they're absolutely authoritative. God in the Bible, because it's inerrant and it's the Word of God, judge culture. On the other hand, and this is what we see, and it's been rather fascinating for me to watch this process work itself out over the last 4 or 5 months, and especially in terms of the COVID-19 piece. And we're going to come back to that in terms of helping us to understand how do I deal with it and what am I actually looking at. Well, as it relates to everything that's going on in the world, culture, however broadly or however narrowly you want to define it, and statistics, and regardless of whether or not the person developing the statistics is reliable. I can remember when I was working on a Master of MBA a couple of 3 decades ago. I walked into a statistics class, and the prof that was teaching it, he said, "Now look," he said, "I want you to understand at the basics of reality is this: when you think about the word statistic, the first word that needs to come to mind is this: statistics are often lies. They are a manipulated set of data that's based on a manipulated set of questions that give you the answers that you want so that you can create a media piece or a propaganda piece or however you want to describe it, so that you can argue your case with some facts. But there's no integrity in the facts. But as has been said over and over again throughout the course of human history, if you make a statement and you argue the fact that it's true a sufficient number of times, it becomes true, even though it is in fact false. And this is the world in which we live. I mean, this is what you are seeing when you see all the fact checker and you see all of those individuals, groups, organizations, etc., and you see the censorship things. It's not about truth. It's not about integrity. It's about message, and there's only one message that's permitted, and we'll come back to some of that here in the weeks ahead. So either you have the God himself and the Bible judging man and culture, or you have culture and statistics judging God in the Bible. And when you talk to people from these other three options, and you start to discuss this, they say, no, culture tells me what is true. The statistics tell me what is true, not the Bible. The Bible is full of errors. And remember, that's a statement that's been made so many times that many people, even in our churches like ours, suspect or are suspicious of the Bible. And so therein lies the part of the problem that we face as we take a look at the cross-generational things. So when we take a look at this idea that God and the Bible judge the culture and provide for us moral absolutes, absolute truth, etc., within that there is a wonderful consequence. That is that freedom. There's a freedom within that's based on the absolutes with responsibility, and we know what's right and wrong. So as long as you stay within the boundaries of that which is right, there is freedom. When you choose to go outside of the boundaries of those absolutes, there are penalties, there are consequences, etc. However, on the other side of the ledger here is this. And because what happens is in a biblical presentation, there is this discussion of responsibility and absolutes and fences and just the blessing of the fence to keep you from from going off the edge of the cliff, etc. Well, what happens is on the other side of the equation, there's this promise of unshackled, autonomous freedom. That is to say that there are no boundaries, and you're promised the opportunity to be able to go as far away from, I'll call it the moral center or whatever, as you choose, and there are no consequences. Well, the unintended consequence of that is this, that when you have that and everybody is functioning this way, that I am not obligated to live within any boundary. Everything is wide open for me to do. Everything is available to me. It doesn't matter who owns it. If I want it, I should be able to get it. And so what the consequence is this. When you have this type of freedom, the natural result is chaos and anarchy. And this is precisely what we've seen most recently in major cities around the country. And what happens as a consequence is this. Because there's only so much chaos that society can handle before you have outright rebellion and revolution, and we'll talk about some of those from a historical perspective here in a few minutes. But what this creates is the necessity for the imposition of arbitrary law and authoritarian control. If you convince the people that the chaos is not worth it, but the only option is going to be for the imposition of arbitrary law and an authoritarian control or totalitarianism. And that's what always happens. I mean, historically speaking, this is what always has happened. And that's why you end up with what we see currently in Venezuela, we see in China, we see in Cuba, we saw in Cambodia, we saw in Germany prior to World War II, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on of all these dictatorial, authoritarian regimes that, because of the total chaos, the population says, we will live under anything other than this. Do whatever you have to do, and we're going to be content with it. Well, that only lasts so long because what happens is that absolute authority results in nobody having any freedoms, and there's no balance between the two of those. And the consequences are deplorable, and we look at human history, we can see this. So now I want to talk about the generations, okay? So and I'm going to come back to the slide in just a second, but this slide that we're going to work through here next is a little bit busy, and it's not perfect, okay? Even the best of the academics who have tried to put this together, it slides back and forth, and some things cross over boundaries, but it at least gives us an idea of who we are, where we came from, at an individual level, and you can say, oh, that's where mom and dad came from, or that's where grandma and grandpa came from. And that explains why they think the way they think. And the events and so forth in their lives have an impact on that. So when we talk about the generation, now there's generations prior to what's known as the lost generation, which was their birth years are 1883 to 1900. They're nicknamed the disoriented generation. It was the generation of World War I, and it was yet at the same time it was one of the last two generations where, at least in terms of the United States, the overwhelming majority, and when I say overwhelming majority, I'm talking 80 to 90% of the population accepted a Christian consensus. And what I mean by that is there is a Bible, there is a God and we're responsible to God, and He will hold us accountable. And the Bible gives us the rights and wrongs that we need to know about, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Prayer is normal, going to church is normal, and it's a wise thing to do, and the list goes on and on and on and on of the things that most of us in this church would consider to be the normal. Now, why are they called the lost generation, and why are they called the disoriented? Well, in the 1800s, mid-1800s, in Europe, there was an upheaval in terms of what was going on from the perspective of the church. And it was the time of the beginning of modern liberalism within Christianity. And the disorientation began to take place because what took place is the idea of an inerrant Bible was questioned and questioned and questioned and questioned. And some schools and some denominations began moving in the direction of repudiating that whole idea. The problem was the people in the church, the average individuals around this country was not able to get their head around it. They couldn't accept that. And so there was this disorientation between what they were hearing, what they were reading, what they were beginning to see manifest itself in the church, in society, etc. And then we had World War I on top of that. And that was the first major war. And World War I was disorienting for the people who were over there fighting it in Europe. And even us getting into the war, it was a disorienting event for us as a nation. And it was the beginning of the adding a set of cracks to this very, very solid set of ideas that had been that which was American, that which was Christian, for hundreds of years. I mean, there were no chinks in the armor until around the mid-1800s, mid-1850s, 1860s, etc. And so they lost their way. That whole generation sort of lost their way. And then when we got pulled into World War I, there was the question of why are we fighting this war? And why are we losing so many people? And so it began this process of disorienting the population of our nation. And when you understand that, there is a deliberate aspect of this in terms of what is done sometimes from a political perspective or even from a religious perspective. If you can get people to be disoriented, they're going to look for something to grab a hold of. They're going to look for something to hold on to. And unfortunately, what they end up holding on to is not anywhere near as good as what they had. Well, the greatest generation, and that's one that we're very familiar with, they're the GI generation. They were born in 1901 to 1927. They were the ones that fought World War II. Some of them would have fought Korea. Some of the World War I or the lost generation would have still fought in World War II, but they were a diminishing part of the population. The GI generation, I mean, they were the ones that gave their lives, and families were solidly behind this. All of the posters and other things of that were associated with World War II were built on the idea of that we are a Christian nation, and we went into this, and we were helping our brethren. We were helping those that were in need. We were helping those that were underneath incredible oppression from very domineering politicians. Well, out of this, but at the same time, what was going on in the 1920s and the 1930s is the next step in the process of the disintegration of the classic position that the Bible is inerrant, the Bible is authoritative. Everybody goes to church. Everybody has a belief and understanding in right and wrong, etc. But this generation that came, that was the next generation after World War II. Now, this generation, the early side of it, some of those lived through the Great Depression. Some of them were in World War II. They also faced Korea and Vietnam. And at the same time, they were the quiet generation because they just wanted to get down. They wanted to hunker down and rebuild. And that's why they were also called the builder generation. And they basically, in their minds, have said, we want things to be right. We want our kids to be able to enjoy. We want our kids to have. We want to have a house. We want to have a place to live as family, etc. And so, they were always looking in their rearview mirror at the Great Depression, and either they lived it, or they heard about it from mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, and they said the message to that generation was work hard and care for your own, and care for your society, care for your community, etc. And this generation, at the same time, had lost its moorings because the whole Christian consensus thing was verging on being completely shattered, or moving from a heartfelt consensus of who they really were to a veneer in a superficial aspect of things. And so they were Christian, but only in the sense that they were members of the church because that's what their families had always been. The belief system was slowly being eradicated, etc. And then we get to the baby boomers. That's my generation. They're called the me generation. And the reason why they're the me generation is because that was the generation where mom and dad tried to give the kids everything as early as they could get. This was the generation of the television. This was the generation of every kid has a bike, and every kid has this. Every kid could be, doing this, that, and the other thing. But at the same time, it was also the generation that dealt with the issue of the whole Vietnam era, and Kent and the Kent State University And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Then we get to Gen X, which is 65 to 80, and that's what's known as the latchkey generation. So it went from the generation of the baby boomers, because this is when we still had large portions of the population were living in communities where oftentimes there were multiple generations in a single household. There was family members, in the house next door, across the street, down the block, and everybody knew everybody. And so there was a lot of care. Now, by the time we get to this 1965 to 1980 generation, when they were being born, this is when all of a sudden we had the economy just blossoms. We effectively became a very rich country, relatively speaking. And then the children that were born were latchkey. Or then we have the DINK, dual income, no kids. Or dual income, no responsibility for kids because they're in childcare. Or mom or grandma would watch over the kids. And this had a huge change in the nature of the society, the nature of the family, etc. Gen Y, or what's known as the millennials, they're a variety of terms. They're the first thoroughgoing internet generation. They're the boomerang generation also because the economy was not quite so good. And so they would go off to college, because what happened during the baby boomers and the Gen Xers is that there was the idea that everybody needed a college education. But the problem was, a lot of those degrees that were beginning to be put out by the universities were not degrees where you could get a job, where you could earn anything. Or I'll call it your blue-collar skilled people could be making more money without ever having gone to college and without having any college debt, and they could be out on their own a lot easier than people who went to college. And so the boomerang aspect of it is this: they come home and they live with mom and dad, who by this time are probably divorced. And divorce begins to become a part of all this. Again, it's the ethos, it's the cracking, it's the shattering of the family structure. Gen Z, interesting, they're called the Zoomers. They're zooming around everything. It's connected to the tech aspect of things. And 9/11, they're all the I or the tech generation. And Gen Alpha, those that are born 1913 and following, they're the ones that nobody knows about. It's not been named yet. They just did the first. So as we take a look at this, okay, so all of those different generations that we just looked at, each of them have their own primary set of beliefs that describe and define them as a generation, tell them how they act, what's important to them, what is right and wrong. And this is the period of time as we go through those generations where you move from absolute right and wrong to accommodating what is right and wrong. And, well, it's sometimes right, it's sometimes wrong, it's sometimes true, it's sometimes false, it's sometimes good, it's sometimes bad. And that begins to influence what's going on in the ethos of the nation. And so as we take a look at this, I want to first look at some resources that, where does the information come from, and how does this begin to impact what's going on? So from a resources perspective, the baseline used to be the Bible, biblical creeds, ethos, doctrine, and confessions. This is where most every American was, all right? And it was the core. I mean, the McGuffey Reader, the New England Primer, et cetera, et cetera. However, at the same time that this goes back, to the Reformation in the 1500s and before, this is what constituted the right and wrong. And in the church itself, even with all the misbehaviors within the church, that's being very kind. And there were issues in the leadership of the church back in those eras, the Dark Ages, et cetera. Nevertheless, there was this sense of accountability to a God, however strict he was presented it to be. But then we go back to the 18th century, the 1700s, and Voltaire and the Enlightenment, and this is just one statement out of a large body of literature that helps you to understand that this coming apart process that we're experiencing today goes back a long time. So Voltaire said, crush the horrid or infamous thing. And when he used that word or that phrase, and it became something that he would sign letters with, it became his mantra. By the horrid thing, he's talking about Christianity. The Enlightenment among the elite, the egalitarian, the goal of the whole Enlightenment was to crush the church so that man can become the standard of all things at the individual level. 1848, the Communist Manifesto comes out by Marx and Engels. In 1933, 73 and 78, we have the three versions or the three iterations of the Humanist Manifesto. And I put these in red deliberately because that really is the side that they're on. At the same time, there were those that were asking hard questions and wrestling with what's going on. 1948, the book Ideas Have Consequences. And by the way, I've read all these things, and so when I say they're resources, they're first level resources from my perspective. I'm not expecting anybody else to go out and read all these things. None of you need that kind of a headache. Weber's book is amazing because it helps you to understand that your ideas do have consequences, whether it's in the home or it's in the office or wherever. And then 1971, Rules for Radicals, which is Alinsky, and just so that you understand, in order to understand the 8 years of the Obama administration, you have to understand Rules for Radicals. This was the Bible for Obama and his entire administration. And the University of Chicago, et cetera. So understand that when we look at politics, the geopolitical things, there is an explanation for all of these things. And Rules for Radicals is the explanation for almost everything that came out of and was a part of the Obama administration. And it's still impacting us today. Along with that comes some other things that and just so that you understand, these are just a snapshot of the pieces of literature that are impacting what's going on. The Gay Liberation Front Manifesto. And when you understand this in 1971, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about Schaeffer and the Great Evangelical Disaster, the other worldview, which we'll look at, I'll be looking at, and I'll be sharing pieces and parts from it through the rest of the summer. At the same time, in contrast to the Communist, the Humanist, and the Gay Liberation Front Manifesto, there is Schaeffer's The Christian Manifesto that was published in 1981. And that's an amazing piece of work. He was a prophet ahead of his time. He had insights that, if you read his works today, you would almost think that they were written yesterday. That's how timely they were. Then at the end of his life, he wrote The Great Evangelical Disaster, and that talks to us and to our community, the evangelical fundamental community as well. Then written in 2015 is The Other Worldviews by Jones, which is an amazing book. It's helping me to understand what I'm seeing in our teens and why what they're doing makes good sense, because that's the way they've been taught. Now, I'm not pinning that on moms and dads and grandma and grandpas. The education system in the U.S. has basically done this, and we'll take a look at. And then there's the Antifa or the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Bray, and that is much more recent. But again, that's an amazing piece of work that helps me to understand what's going on in all of these cities and the burnings. But it also goes back. Now, I'm gonna run through the consequences of worldviews, and this is going to be a very rapid, very fast history lesson. But understand that when we go back to the 17th, 18th centuries and the world and humanism and secular humanism and so forth, we begin to see consequences. And understand that there's positive aspects of this. Okay, the American Revolution, which was predominantly Protestant, with a little bit of aggravation from the Anglicans in England, was a worldview war. And if you read our founding fathers, that becomes very, very clear. Now, it was Protestant, which means it was Reformation, which means it was based on a Bible that was inerrant, it was authoritative, it told them what to do, what not to do, it told them how to fight the war, it told them how to set up the government, et cetera, et cetera. And we see a very different consequence to that up to the early 1900s, when the progressives with Teddy Roosevelt and others began to take control, and they began to take the U.S. in another direction, and we eventually saw the consequences of Catholicism and the Jesuits and liberation theology beginning to have its impact. Now, on the other hand, you go back across the Atlantic, and the French Revolution, and just as a study, the question that we should be asking is, why did the American Revolution and the French Revolution turn out very differently? Why was there the guillotine? Why was there the slaughter of the population in France and not in the United States? Well, it was because of the nature of Catholic doctrine, Catholic tradition, etc. Then we have the whole Cold War from 1947 to 1991. That's a part of this. That's part of the idea set. Then we have some things happening in the United States. 1962, public prayer was removed from the public schools. That was a very deliberate set of decisions that were made by a number of people, including those that were in the Supreme Court. And then we had in 1963, public Bible readings were removed from public schools. And what you're doing is you're removing from the educational process of our students the mores, the foundation, the principles, the ideas, and the affirmation on a daily basis that there is a God, His word is important, it is inerrant, it tells the truth, etc. And then we get to from my generation, this was when I was a sophomore in junior in high school, the UCLA Berkeley Free Speech Movement. And what I just put a note here is this. This is when tolerance becomes intolerance. Prior to this point in the 1960s, the idea when we use the word tolerance, tolerance could be defined this way, is the willingness to agree to disagree in an informed manner. The willingness to agree to disagree in an informed and factual manner. You're welcome to your position, but you're not welcome to your opinion if it doesn't have something that supports it. And this is the beginning of the time when my free speech doesn't have to have anything to do with facts. It's my opinion. And then we get UCLA People's Park battle in Chicago in 1969, the Days of Rage. Some of you remember that election and that election process. 1970 was the Kent State University uprising, which had to do with Vietnam. And all of these are connected. And I'm just going to skip way forward. 2019, the New York Times 1619 project. And by the way, this project is the intellectual foundation for almost all of the systemic racism, the racism stuff that we see going on, and the way it's being articulated. And it goes back to this project that was written, that's been torn apart by reputable historians, but because of the fact that the New York Times is projecting it, selling it both from an academic perspective, but also from a media perspective, it's winning the day. You can see this in the 2019 COVID policy decisions and the data manipulation. And we will talk more about that. And the reason that I'm bringing this up in this context is I want you to be thinking through, how did we get here? And what was the process that we went through? And why do some people have, and it's more than just opinion, okay? And this is the struggle that we're in, and this is the struggle that our young people are in. And we as adults need to wrestle through this. And Lord willing, over the summer, we will work through this. because I want you to understand, and I'm not suggesting that I have the right answers on any of these things, or that my position on some of these things is right. Um, but it's how do we get to these positions, and how do we make decisions without being manipulated by fear and terror, right? And so then the riots across the U.S., and to answer the question, why is the U.S. burning? Well, in a simple term, in a simple statement, I will say this. The reason that the U.S. is burning is because in the hearts and minds of the majority, and yes, the majority of Americans, there is no longer a God to whom they are going to be, to whom they are accountable. There's no longer an authoritative body of literature that does deal with objective, absolute rights and wrongs. And as long as there are no rights and wrongs, the nation will burn. This is the anarchy that we're talking about. This goes back to the French Revolution that we looked at just a minute ago, and that's where. So this is where I'm going to leave you today, and then over the next several weeks, I want to start to unpack some of this. I want to take the time to unpack that first option, so that as you think about this, as you wrestle with, okay, how do I interact with my kids? How do I interact with my grandkids? How do I interact in community? And how do I live a consistent life based on that belief system that I say that I accept? But as we take a look at this, and the one thing that is extremely significant here is this. I can remember, and maybe it's just me and my mom and dad and my family, but if there is one phrase that I heard growing up and even as an adult that impacts me on a daily basis is this: actions speak louder than words. Well, when we're talking about worldviews, actions speak louder than words. And those actions are justified by the belief system because you say, I have with a clear conscience, I can do this, or I can do that. And as we work with our young people, helping them to understand, no, you can't do that and say that you are a Christian. Because there is this Bible that is authoritative in both principle and statement. There are principles in the Scriptures that apply to life's circumstances. And when we walk ourselves through what the Scriptures say, and then as we look at the things that it says, it says this is right and that is wrong. This is an abomination to God, and this is what pleases God. If that's not deeply embedded in our hearts and minds, we won't act according to that. We can verbalize it, but our actions will not validate our words, or our words won't validate our actions, and we'll be hypocrites in many respects. So anyway, so this is where we're going to go over the rest of the summer. It's a bit daunting, and I will be honest with you, as I continue to read and I try to understand where the 21st century is, where this generation is, what's being taught to this generation, what's being taught to us because we have all this information that's being thrown at us from the media, how to be able to sort it out and to be able to discern what's right, wrong, true and false, without having to go to a fact checker that's also censoring. And so that's where. So let's just close in a word of prayer, and I'll let you go. Thank you for putting up with this, and I'm excited about the fact that Lord willing, I'll be standing at the front. I know Pastor's looking forward to that as well, and then we can get back to normal where I can actually see people, and I can see the responses, and I can see your eyes going, oh my goodness, or whatever. So anyway, Lord, thanks for today. Thank you for your amazing grace and goodness. Thank you for your word. Lord, thank you for the rock that it is, and thank you for the refuge that it is, and thank you for all those passages throughout the Psalms and elsewhere where we find our relationship to be to you to be directly connected to our relationship to your word. And Father, thank you for it. And we just ask your blessings on the evening and the rest of the week, and may we prepare for getting back together again in more collective way. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.